Hello, my name is James Vin, and I'm current president of SDXD. I started this role back in June of 2019, and I was preceded by Tara Jensen.
Yeah, and for me, SDXD was for me a great opportunity to learn about a different way to design and transition from graphic design into another area. So it was a great opportunity to learn after college, and it was a free space to learn and a great way to get connected with people in that industry. So I joined SDXD because I wanted it to keep being what it was when I had first found it. So for me, it was the value of like creating that community in an environment that was inclusive for anybody, regardless of, making it an accessible community and a learning opportunity outside of college to potentially transition to another industry and to learn more to elevate your skills within that industry.
What I wanted and what I'm so proud of doing is we built a community of people who were interested in experience design. And we specifically called it experience design to be really broad, right? Because we knew that there are UX designers, graphic designers, all kinds of designers that were doing things that were all around experience design. And we all talked about it. We have similar interests, similar passions. And so we created a community so that people can come together and share that. And that was the whole point.
Yeah, I feel like it just delivers on those core values that we have of inspiration, connection, education. And with every single event I went to, that always came out. So I'm just so happy to be a part of this. And as Paul said, so proud of what we built.
And we do mention this, right? Which is we're over 3,000 members now. And
3,200 as of today.
3,200. I mean, what do you think about that, James? I'm looking at you.
Blows my mind. Yeah, it's really to call out the current situation that we're in. While there's a lot going on, just every morning when I wake up and I look at my emails and see all the new members that have joined from around the world, just feel so blessed that we have the support and also that we have this platform where we can offer value and just something positive for people.
Yeah, it's just mind blowing how it's grown. It's really interesting, when I started and when I took over as president, I think we had, at least on paper, maybe about 320 members. But it's an interesting thing because, this SDXD grew out of actually a prior existing organization that was called Sankai. And it was actually affiliated with ACM Kai, right? That long-standing, very venerable institution. And they had done some great things, right? Gotten some great speakers, gotten some really awesome content. It had run its course, and it had come to a point where, it had about 300 members. They had meetups, and on a good day, you'd get maybe 30 people in, which was quite good. It felt like there was more that we can do. And so that's where we started, at about 300 members. About 30 of them were really active that would show up. And by the end of my term, if you will, I think we were somewhere near 1,400. And so that just sort of started that groundswell.
I know. I'm like trying to remember how much we grew during the time that I was there. So I picked up right after Paul. Paul had so much momentum already going. So it was really just trying to kind of continue what we had and figure out what was the next steps. And I think we were able to grow at least another 1,000 members in the 2.5 years that I was president. So we just kind of tried to, make sure that we were providing value to the community, helping them grow in different ways, bring topics that were of interest to them to make sure, we were serving our community. And then in came James and just continued skyrocketing that membership.
Yeah, I feel really fortunate. I always tell folks that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants because you both just set the infrastructure so well for myself and the new leadership team to come in and hit the ground running and know exactly what we needed to do and how to do it. But I would love to hear about how it was in the early days and getting sorted out.
It's so funny, like in the early days, right? We had a ragtag but very dedicated crew of people. It was all volunteer, as it always is and still is now. But we were much smaller, and it was very much like just bootstrap, like do whatever you can. And I think it's a credit to that original group that how dedicated they were to making this work. Like we did everything that we could. And that was one of the first things that I think was a very important thing, which was to put a little more structure to it so that it didn't feel like such a just emergency, like all hands on deck. Every time we had an event, it was all hands on deck. And that doesn't really make for sort of a strategy, a vision. Also, it's just really high stress, honestly. And so, one of the first things that we did was we got the core group of people who were really, really dedicated, and we actually made it into a real board. And what that means is that we had defined roles, and that was really important for a number of reasons, right? For one, it was just for structure and understanding like who owns what. That was important. But also just as important, and like if you're building a community like this or a meetup, it's really important to acknowledge the contributions of the people who are actually organizing this thing. And so when we have defined roles, they can actually say that, they can tout that on their LinkedIn profile and those types of things. And so that was one of the first things that we did, which was like really come up with some defined roles for the leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that structure that Paul created, I think, really helped me get up and running as when I kind of jumped in as the president role. And then we just kind of figured out like what are different ways that we could, I guess, sort of optimize particular roles and give people even more ownership over different roles. So we just kind of like continued down that trajectory, I would say, in order to have like repeatable processes that people owned. And that, I think that really just made a lot of things a lot more easier and helped us like kind of think about like, how can we do bigger things? How can we have these other initiatives? What initiatives can we offer to people that will help them grow and appeal to them as a volunteer for this community? So many different strategies we can go into here.
Yeah, as mentioned, it's a all volunteer org, and I'd love to hear a little bit about where and how do you find these people and how do you attract them onto the board?
Well, I have a funny story about how I got onto the board. I was actually, there was another local UX meetup that was doing some really great events, and I was there with some colleagues. And one of my colleagues was actually on the board of Sankai. And she had said, hey, we are doing these events, and would you like to be a part of it? And I was like, yeah, that sounds really great. But of course, it's very social kind of occasion, and I didn't really think much of it. And the next day, like I was on an email chain. It's like, hey, Paul's joining the board, and we're doing it. I think it's just getting people who are like-minded and interested. In my case, tricking them into joining. But but I think that's the key. And there's always like, it's amazing how many people actually really do want this kind of thing. And it's a great opportunity. So all you got to do is just kind of ask, just see who's interested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did a lot of things where we had volunteers take on particular roles, and if they did particularly well in those roles, that was when I would maybe have a conversation of like, hey, do you want to potentially join the board? We were pretty established, I think, by the time I was running SDXD, so people were definitely interested in being part of it. But we also did a lot of things to get people interested in like if you wanted to grow your research skills, how can we come up with something that would be beneficial to us and also to you, like doing research with having access to our members and being able to do one-on-one research with them and then draft up some member highlights about them. But that kind of gives you an inside opportunity to like get to know what it's like to work at these different companies. So like what kind of opportunities could we provide that would also help you build your skills in a particular way? So there's a lot of ways to get creative with it, I think. But in general, just the access to the speakers and the access to the people that work at all these companies and the interactions that you have among the board is just kind of a great learning opportunity. So kind of just like highlighting those aspects, I think really helped draw interest. And then given the fact that you also have to, maybe bring food to an event or something like that, it might not be the most amazing, task, but it gives you access to like these different board members who might be maybe more senior level, or the people that are speaking at your events that you want to have access to.
Yeah, I feel like the volunteer experience is such a great way to get ramped up and really understand just all the planning and work that goes into putting on these events. And at the same time, we always like to thank you and acknowledge our volunteers. So that moment when you see the volunteer thank you slide, it's really fulfilling and it's really joyful. And I feel like the board is just a whole nother level of that in terms of involvement, but also in terms of the satisfaction.
Yeah, and wasn't it Paul who came up with the high five slide?
The high five slides. Yeah. Which, by the way, the last time we did that, which was a while ago, James, you almost like broke my hand when we did a high five. Like
we'll insert the picture.
Iron fist. Yeah, and I think that's a great point, right? And again, it's the same kind of thing that I had mentioned before about like having actual roles, so that you define the roles, right? That's just structural, but there's a recognition for your efforts. Same thing with volunteers, right? And it's really important. It goes a long way. And it's just one of the kind of the more sort of mundane things, but it really makes a big difference. Which is like Tara said, at the beginning of every event, we have this high five slide. We're like, look, these are all the people who made this possible. And if you happen to see them next to you, give them a high five. And it's always a really nice kind of social way to do it. And so I think that was one of the, that's one sort of tangible tip for people, is to really recognize people. It goes a long way for the people who have put together the event to be recognized for it by their peers at that event.
Yeah. Internally, we talk about how they're the true heroes of the events, because while we may be doing the high level planning and making sure everything's in place, without those people at the front desk, signing people in, giving them their name tags, helping us set up the food and beverage station, these events just wouldn't be feasible.
And that's exactly what we say, right, in front of that slide. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about creating a vision. And again, this is about sort of organizing. And I do think that it's important that even at the beginning, act like you're a fairly mature organization, right? It's okay. It's never too soon to put structure to things. It's never too soon to have official roles. In fact, it's really important, even in the early days, to have official roles. But on top of that, one of the things that we did back in my day was we created a vision or a mission statement, if you will. And it was around 3 pillars. And I think the pillars have carried on to this day, but it's okay if it evolves, because that's the whole point. But we, as a group at that time, we came up with this idea that we want to focus on education, inspiration, and community. And within those 3 sort of broad pillars, we had a lot of efforts and a lot of ideas. And we even did things like in the early days, we thought about it, we're like, let's distribute our events that would happen on a monthly basis across these 3 pillars and make sure that we have, a good mix of those. And so, those were, your mileage may vary if you're doing your own community, but those things seem to be the right fit for our community at the time. There's this hunger for like education and cross-sharing and learning, right? There was also this hunger about inspiration to see what other people in the community are doing. And then community building itself, right? Like bringing people together. We had a lot of designers in San Diego who felt like islands, right? They were working their own thing, one-man design, one-person design team. And they felt really sort of isolated. And so those 3 things were really salient things that came up. And we very purposefully thought about that when we were building the community and actually planning our events.
Amazing. You'll be happy to hear that those 3 things are still the pillars that we reference and think about today. And there's also an external benefit there, because when you're connecting with a new speaker or a sponsor, you can very clearly articulate that we are a community that sets out to inspire, connect, and educate, and really build off all of those points.
So one of the things is, especially in the early days of a community like this and organizing something like this, is you have a small dedicated crew, but there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done. And so there is actually, because, let's face it, this is all volunteer. This is all on just the passion of the people organizing themselves. They have day jobs. And so there's a significant chance of burnout. They just have to do too many things. And so that was something that we were pretty conscious of, even in the early days. And, I'm wondering how you guys address that. I mean, I know how we did, but we were much smaller at the time. And so, we just did a lot. But do you guys have any thoughts to share about that?
I think burnout is definitely, I mean, everybody's got a full-time job that's volunteering. So you always have to be prepared for vacations or for people to be, working overtime here or there or whatever. So you have to be prepared for someone to be able to like pick up where someone might not be available. So, we started doing a lot more frequent meetings and really casual meetings. And it was whoever can make it, just to kind of make sure everybody was up to speed on what was going on, so that if someone needed to step in, they could. But also just making sure that people had very specific, like repeatable tasks with a schedule. I think that really helped without having to like explain to somebody like, oh, okay, these are the social channels we use, and these are the people that you need to mention. And this is when you should mention this thing versus that thing or something like that, without having to explain that over and over again, to get a social media person who knows like, this week I do this type of a post and I have all week to do it. The next week I do this type of a post and I have all week to do it. Really kind of, makes it a little bit more flexible. But when it comes to actually having the events come together and everything, like trying to stagger our workshop versus our talks, because workshops take a lot of work and you need some time to do it. I think that was also a big part of it. James, I don't know, do you have other strategies?
Yeah, I'll definitely echo what you're saying, Tara, about just operationalizing the processes so it's very streamlined and it won't eat up a ton of time every time. And to build off of that thread, I feel like there's a level of understanding what you're good at or what you enjoy or what you want to learn more about, because as you're doing that work, you'll be able to think about the experience that you're gaining and also these skills that will be applicable far beyond the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And to the point of burnout in general, I feel like our team has been really, really good at communicating how we're feeling. So if someone's taking a vacation or someone's taking a time off, of course, it's no worries at all. We definitely encourage that. So just keeping it very open and clear.
I think SDXD is also like, the entire time I've been involved in it, and even before, you could see that the board, all of the board members were very, very close. It kind of ends up being, there's ways to like make your board meetings, I think, just feel very dry and like we're on this like task, and we have this agenda. But like, having some of those casual meetings kind of makes it feel a little bit more fun and almost like a little bit more of a release. So there's ways of, I think, making your meetings a little bit more casual, and then, you kind of just build that friendship among all the board members, which I think kind of helps combat some of the burnout. While you might be, running really hard to get something to happen, at least you kind of have this community of people that you have a lot of fun with.
I think that's a great point, and that is really definitely one of the hallmarks of our group, was that it was work to put these things together, but it was also camaraderie, right? It was also a group of friends with a shared passion. And you started to look forward to planning meetings. You started looking forward, to getting together and doing these things because they were fun. And you were hanging out with people that you like. And so I think that is really important, is the leadership team. You want to build a team of people who genuinely like working together. It's just like any other thing, right? The best teams are the ones that really like each other as people, and treat each other with respect. And if you can even form those deeper connections, even better. And so I feel like that was, I don't even know if it was that intentional on our part. I think it's one of those sort of self-fulfilling prophecies where you attract the kind of people that you want to hang out with. But I feel really fortunate, at least, during my time, we had a great cohort of people. I look forward every time that we have planning meetings to getting together and doing these things.
I think there was some level of tension to some of it though. Because, when I joined the board, there was board meetings were always at a place where you could also get a drink. And you're also surrounded by people who are in the same industry. So if you're struggling with something at work, you can also kind of get a little bit of help there. So there's that added value of getting together in that way. We always made a point to go somewhere that would be fun and have our board meetings at different places. So it just added this extra level of fun to it. And when we started doing those weekly, like, you don't have to be there every single week, whoever could make it, they became a lot more casual. And I really think that added to, like, this is kind of a hangout thing, but it also, we're going to get some stuff done, and maybe it made the amount of stuff we had to get done a little bit smaller, which maybe helped alleviate some of that.
Yeah, it totally did. It was something to look forward to. I still look back very fondly every Wednesday. I knew there would be just a table of familiar smiling faces ready to meet. And it really was that mix of planning and of having fun and hanging out, because we'd get through all of our items and then inevitably people would just want to hang out and talk longer. So I can very comfortably say some of my closest friends in San Diego I've met through this organization.
That's amazing that you guys do weekly, by the way. I mean, back in my day, we did monthly, and that felt good. And the fact that you do weekly, that's amazing. That's awesome.
It's gonna be too much, I think, at first, but everybody realized it was a lot more casual, and then people just were more casual about it, which I think worked, but it might not work for every group.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you still doing these things?
We are. Now that it's on Zoom, it's much, much easier.
Right.
I wanted to ask, did either of you ever feel that sense of burnout during your time as president? And if yes, what did you do? Or if not, what did you do to prevent that?
Well, I can answer from my perspective, and maybe this is one of those sort of like real talk moments, which is, it'd be odd if you didn't have a sense of burnout, especially when you're leading an organization like this. Sometimes it feels like too much. So I think it's definitely something to be conscious of, and everybody has their own way of sort of dealing with these kind of things. For me, it was just my personal commitment to making this work, and that's what carried me through. And I'm glad. And it wasn't always just like a constant burden or anything like that. But burnout's a real thing, and you should be aware of it. And especially if you're the president and leading it, a lot is on you, and you're always on. But you should be aware of that with your board members, and be respectful of that. Sometimes you can sense it, and you're just like, look, why don't you just take this month off? Like, you don't have to work the event or anything like that. And you just have to be cognizant of it, right? Because, an underlying theme is really around organizing this is it's all volunteer. These are not paid positions. If you can make an organization where you're like paid to organize it, great, like fantastic. That's amazing. But for the most part, these are volunteer things. And so you have to be really aware of that. You can ask too much of certain people. And so you have to dial it back. And that was actually something that I was very aware of, is that I would try to spread the load as much as possible so that it's manageable.
Mm-hmm. Definitely agree. You got to be aware of the fact that, like, people have, stuff going on with their family. They've got stuff going on at work that's going to get in the way, and you have to be prepared for that, especially if you're leading the organization. So for me, I was always kind of willing to take on a little bit more, just because I felt a lot of ownership over the events. I wanted everyone else to feel it also. But I always felt like, if this event goes horribly wrong, it's going to reflect poorly on me or something like that, So I wanted all these details to be ironed out. So I would put in all this extra effort to make sure that we were considering all of these things that could go wrong, and how do we account for that. I would definitely put myself into burnout situations because I wanted these events to be amazing, And at the end of the event, once an event goes, I'm really nervous walking in. I hope everything goes to plan. But at the end of the event, you get that, like, I don't know, the endorphins of like, everything went so great, and everybody's saying all these great things about it. So it kind of just that roller coaster of like stress, and then like, I don't know, stress is the down, right? Stress, and then like, this went so well. Like, you feel so great afterwards, and then you're so ready to do it again. Yeah. But also, we also had the, like, our head of events would take on a lot of the planning, and then we'd kind of trade out the different roles.
Yeah, I feel you. There's something there, and for me, it's almost intrinsic, where no matter how stressful or time consuming or energy consuming it was, once you get to the end and someone shakes your hand or gives you a hug and said, that was amazing, thank you so much for doing this, or now when you get a DM. Recently, there was a gentleman from South Africa who unfortunately had just been laid off. And I got a message and he said, even though your events take place in the middle of the night local time, I love watching the recordings. It just gives me a sense of community and that I'm not alone. And just moments and testimonies like that are so inspiring and driving. So that's kind of what prevents my burnout.
That's such a great point you guys bring this up, which is it is so worth it always. You know, it may not feel like it, like the night before when you're like, our venue just canceled on us. Like, what are we supposed to do? But you always find a way. And when you're there and you see all the people and it's going great, and like Tara said, when people are like, I'm so glad you put this on, thank you so much, it's so worth it. And that never fails to kind of recharge your batteries.
There's nothing like it.
So, you know, hosting events, the events themselves are sort of like that's kind of like the bread and butter of like a community thing, especially like a meetup kind of community, right? You have these events. It's an interesting thing, and maybe we'll touch on it a little bit around in the era of the pandemic, what that means. But, you know, a lot of the stuff that like I'll share is back in the day when we were doing live events, right? Where we actually got together. So holding events, right? There's a lot, and I think there's a lot of sort of like war stories that we can share. I know from my point of view, one of the key things that we ended up doing was actually having, and we use Trello because I love Trello forever. And so we ended up using Trello to actually have like defined roles. Because what we were finding was, as a fledgling organization, email threads, who's got what, you know, and invariably somebody's like, I thought you had that. No, I thought you had that. And it would lead to a mad scramble every time. And so one of the key things, and one of the things that I would suggest for organizers, especially new organizers, is to have defined roles and have that, especially for the logistics of the day itself, is super important. I mean, it's almost like, I imagine, although I don't know much about this, like wedding planning. It's fraught, things are moving fast, people are showing up. So the more that you can just put automatic structures around it and know who's doing what, the better. And so we ended up doing that. We had people who were just like, your one job is to make sure that we have signage. That's it. Don't worry about anything else, but get there, put the signs up on the table, tape stuff to trees and windows, whatever you need to do. And we know that that one thing is taken care of. And we would parcel out aspects of events like that.
Mm-hmm. And get there early before everyone shows up, right? Because like, you know, there's going to be people that show up before the event start time while you're still setting up. So you have to make sure that the people that you give those roles to are going to be there early. So there's a lot of things to consider, you know, and you don't want the food to show up too early if you're doing pizza or something like that, because nobody wants cold pizza. If it shows up a little bit after people show up, that's not a big deal because warm pizza, you know?
Totally, yeah. It's kind of wild. I still remember the first event when I was on the organizing board, and the perception of time just gets so crazy. Like the 3 hours feels like it'll pass by in the blink of an eye. So if you don't have those defined roles set up and everyone's moving autonomously, there's not a lot of time to be able to check your phone, stop, let them know what's going on, and then return to what you need to do.
One thing we did, so like we had a lot of people taking different roles when I was originally on the board and before I had stepped into the president role. And then we ended up creating signage that was laminated, and then I just brought a bin of all of these things that might be useful at all these events. Like, we're almost always going to use Sharpies and Post-its. So I just had a massive collection of those, the signage and, some dry erase markers and all that kind of stuff. And just making sure that I would get to the event and talk to the venue host and like make sure that we knew where we were setting up and everything. And knowing people were going to start showing up a little early, being able to like just assign people like, oh, okay, well, you're on signs now, rather than some of them being like assigned in advance. That ended up kind of working just because of how early some people would show up. So that ended up sometimes being a volunteer role or whatever the first few board members were to show up, it would be like, okay, signs have to go out first. And then, so I would know what are those first few things that needed to be put out, and just made sure I had my bin of everything just always in the back seat of my car pretty much the entire time that I was president. So
it's now in the back seat of my car, so it's safe. It's in good hands. Yeah, so a lot goes into this, and we don't want to bore you by describing every single role and forcing you to take notes. So for a complete list and descriptions, check out the brand new SDXD playbook. It's going to have that information and much, much more.
We've definitely faced a variety of issues, I think, with a lot of our events. There's all sorts of unexpected things that, might happen. People who are getting the food, are having some issues getting through traffic, or traffic even keeping people from showing up to events. So a big part of just planning for these things is just making sure that you're padding your event plan with networking at the beginning and networking at the end, but like really pad it at the end so that you can have your start time, flex a little bit more, and then still have a little bit at the end, because people don't always want to stay at these events too late, but they don't, and it feels weird if you leave in the middle of a presentation or something like that. So like, how can you plan to make sure that your event fits within your time block that you have and can go over into it? But also like planning for different ways things can go wrong up front can make you just plan better for your event in general. So like, what are the different ways people are going to get maybe stuck on what they're going to do, and what kind of materials can you provide to help them follow along or help them know what to do at certain points? I'm sure you guys have run up on all sorts of issues like this. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys to talk about some of the issues you faced.
I have one thing that was a really interesting thing that we actually did, because we found it was our own, it was a monster of our own making, which is we actually designated, speaking back to sort of, set roles. We had somebody who was like time master, who their role was like, we got the agenda and you're going to signal to people like, we got to move it along, because it is really easy to draw things out and kind of get off track. And it's really important to be mindful, like you're saying, about there's a certain amount of time, right? And usually the events are during the work week. And so you got to be mindful of that. People are not going to hang out until like 11 p.m., right? And so that is one thing that, just somebody who's just going to sit there and signal like, hey, 2 minutes, and then we're going to go on to the next bit. It's a really important thing. And we actually, again, the division of labor, so that's manageable. Having somebody, that's their one job. You got the agenda in front of you and you're walking around and you're making sure that it's going. That goes a long way for a very smooth event.
Yeah, that's a great point. And a lot of the times, the venue that you're partnering with to host the event at, there will be a hard cutoff time where for janitorial reasons, for security reasons, they need you out the door. And getting 100+ people who are talking with each other and engaged without a clear signal, it's very hard to keep them moving. So wholeheartedly agree on having a timekeeper.
Yeah, so I think like one of the biggest things we learned was like, never plan your event to end 30 minutes before the actual end of the event if you want to have networking, because that means you're pretty much going to have to make everyone leave right after the event and they're all going to want to talk about it. So my rule of thumb was always like, plan for an hour of networking, maybe schedule it as if there's not going to be that much and the event ends a little bit earlier. People aren't going to be so upset if it ends a little bit earlier, but they're not going to be so happy if it goes over, and your venue's not going to be happy if it goes over, depending, but also you should plan for that in advance, like know your venue and know whether or not they're okay with it going a little over, but don't schedule it that way,
Right. And then you can have an after party venue all set up and call that out during the opening statements, and then have a few kind of guiding folks get people out of the building and said, hey, we'll see you at the bar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another aspect of that is like, things that can cause your events to go over is like, I've been to events before where they'll do like a panel talk and they'll be like, all right, we're going to take a break for a while. Everybody go grab a drink or something. But then rallying everybody back together can be very difficult, and that can add a lot more time. So if you're putting these different moments where people are moving around, you have to be very conscious of that. And I think we've even done events where we had people just keep track of the time and actually hold signs up around so that different facilitators knew what was going on. Because if you have like an event where you have 10 different facilitators and you want everybody to end at the same time, you really need somebody to take on a role like, all right, we're 5 minutes in, it's 1 minute away from the next
Yeah.
topic.
And even just a handwritten sign with large red markings, 1 minute remaining, can go a long way.
And I think that's sort of a pro tip as well, which is, and we'll probably speak to this a little bit more, but when you have a speaker, especially somebody who's really passionate about their topic, sometimes they're going to go a little long. And hopefully you set sort of ground rules at the beginning. Having that kind of signage where somebody in front holds up, you know, they can write in Sharpie or they already have pre-printed cards, 10-minute warning, 5-minute warning really helps them keep track of that and honor that time frame. Because I do think that like it's really easy, especially when you get somebody who's passionate about it, they'll just talk all night about it, which is great. But after about an hour and, you know, it's a Wednesday night, you know, you're going to want to wrap it up. And so
Yes.
I think it's a really important sort of, it's an important tip to have.
If you ever encounter a speaker like that, just say, we love your passion and enthusiasm, and it'd be amazing to have you back next year for a follow-up event.
Right.
Or even just cutting off the amount of questions you have, or allow that the audience to ask, and then mentioning like, oh, the speaker's going to be at the after bar if you want to have a further discussion with them, which helps drive people out of the venue and to the next destination.
And I will reiterate on something that you mentioned, Tara, which I think is really important, but may not be obvious, which is this idea of like, because everybody does pre-networking, right? You show up and you're letting people show up and you have that buffer. You use it both for buffer time, but then also for networking. And then you have your main topic or content. But tacking on networking time at the end was huge. And I remember when we did that, it was actually based on actual feedback, right? People were like, oh, I wish, you know, we had just a little bit of time because like, you know, we did the talk and it was great. And then everybody gets hustled out. And I would love to kind of like share with some of my colleagues, like, what did you think about that? I thought that was cool. Maybe there's a little time to actually just, you know, walk up to a speaker and ask them some questions, in a very casual way. And so I feel like even just half an hour of post networking is huge.
Mm-hmm. I think at that point too, everybody wants to talk about what their favorite. I think the networking just gets easier or something after the event.
Right.
Like when you just walk into an event and maybe you don't know anybody yet, you don't really know what to talk to them about yet. But after an event, you have all of this content from the presentation or from the workshop that you can talk to anybody in the room about. You know, oh, what did your group do? You know, it's like it's much easier to network, I think, after an event.
You know, it's really interesting. Like you have your individual events, right? And it's very like, you know, it's sort of tactical and you're running those. There's actually a broader thing, especially as your group matures, around planning ahead, planning your events, right? And I know like when we first started our journey, it was very reactionary. I mean, I'll be honest. And anybody viewing this, maybe it wasn't obvious from the outside, but sometimes we would literally be scrambling like the week before the set date to find what we were going to do and the venue and all that kind of stuff. And that adds so much like stress to it. And so, you know, one of the really important things is to start planning ahead as soon as you can. I mean, you can't control everything, but you start planning ahead. And I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Well, what helped us, you know, like when you were president and I got to kind of observe a little bit, we always did that 1 year out planning where we all like brainstormed topics or had gotten some topics from the community and like kind of figured out what would be our timeline for the year, which gave us a place to, you know, something to aim for, and gave us the opportunity to plan, you know, at least, you know, we could start doing at least some little bits of planning, you know, 3 or 4 months out even, which made it such a big difference in being able to figure out like what we're doing. We would still have situations where we were scrambling, you know, with specific details about like, you know, even sometimes a week before, but usually we had a pretty decent plan. James, do you want to jump in.
Yeah,
Like, are you guys still dealing with that now?
I gotta say, the practice and activity of setting a vision has been so powerful. Just thinking about the year ahead, even if you don't end up touching on all of those points. So we'll actually insert some pictures so you can see what our end of 2019 going into 2020 session looks like. But we're really discussing kind of this mixture of what's valuable, what's novel and hasn't been discussed for, and then what's feasible. And that really set the tone for the events for the rest of the year.
So for a lot of the planning that we would do, a lot of it was like internal with the board, but we realized we really needed to seed a little bit more of that from the community to make sure that we're answering what they wanted to hear about. So for, I think, like the last 3, maybe 4 events of the year before we would do our planning, which actually was a little bit earlier than that, but we would ask people to just, put Post-its on a wall with just like a question of like, hey, would you like to hear more about this topic? What other topics would you like to hear about? We're planning our next year of events. What is of interest to you? And then just snap pictures of that like every month so that we could build that into our planning events. And I think, James, you took that to like a next level when you took on the presidency.
Yeah, we really enjoyed the community aspect of getting their input and seeing what people really wanted to hear about. So we surfaced that into different themes, and then we invited about 20 folks from the community from all different types of companies and all levels of seniority to connect in person. And we really treated this like a proper professional meeting. So we sent out a calendar invite with an agenda. There was an intake form to try to prime people on things to think about. What have you been hearing about in the industry? What would you like to hear about? Do you know anyone who's a local expert? And then we all gathered at Blink UX to meet in person, just really work through these. As we said on the slide, we approached it like a design challenge, and we affinitized common themes, and we dot voted on what resonated the most, and we had a really tasty dinner. So if you're starting out and you have the bandwidth, we highly recommend getting feedback from your community and then synthesizing all of that information to inform your programming.
Mm-hmm. I remember that. It was like an event in itself. It was organized just like a meetup event, but then you brought all these people from the community in. That was a great next level move, I thought.
Speaking of levels, we actually we didn't touch on this earlier, but I think it's an important thing, which is this notion of like a succession plan. I think that's a very important thing. We talked about, you have your core group, they're very passionate, but how do you have longevity, right? Across time, across cohorts, right? Like, I was really passionate, but if I left, does that mean the whole thing falls apart? And I was really aware of that, right? Because we had a very small core group, during my time. And if any one of them were just like, can't do it anymore, it would be really hard. And so once we had a certain level of critical mass, it was really important to have this idea of like, who's going to carry it forward, having some structure and infrastructure that you can hand over, the connections that you make, hand those over. And then also, it's an interesting thing. I know just from my experience when Tara took over, it was her show, but I made sure to make myself available in case she had some questions, or she was like, what is up with this file? Or why did you do this stupid Trello list? Like, I don't understand it. You were there to have this sort of succession, but it was really important that somebody else pick up the banner, because otherwise, and I think this happens a lot, is once a person who's really passionate about a group like this, community group, once they're done because they get busy, life gets in the way or whatever, the thing just kind of gradually goes away. And so one thing that I've really been so impressed with this group is how much it's grown, right? And so, I wonder, Tara, if you have any thoughts about that.
I have a lot of thoughts about that. I actually, it was very valuable to me to have you, Paul, to lean on when I was taking on this role and didn't necessarily know what to do, and then had those connections to like get things going right away. And there was some events already planned that I could just like, all right, we're just gonna run with these right away. But when it came to like once I got the ball rolling and I kind of figured out like, okay, how this all works, you know, getting different people onto the board that I realized were passionate, like James, knowing when to step down was a very important part of that, you know? So you don't want to hold on to that role for too long, especially if you have really passionate people on the board that you can tell are interested in it. So I had conversations with people along the way of like, you know, oh, what more are you looking to do with this? And I realized that there were people that wanted, you know, to move up into this position that I had. And once I knew that, I knew I needed to get out of the way and allow space for them to take it on, but also be available for them as they needed. So I was very lucky that, you know, James was very passionate about it and was interested, and had to know that that was the right time to step down. So I'll pass it over to James to elaborate more on that side.
Yeah, for sure. This concept of continuity, like we're discussing, it's so beautiful to see a group just live on and continue to grow and thrive. And I feel like one thing that's really been helpful is leveraging volunteers. So of course, a volunteer is going to start in a simple role like doing sign-in, helping with cleanup. But the more and more they bond with the board, a lot of times these kind of natural bonds form. And someone might say, hey, I want to learn more about what you do. It seems really interesting. And it's like a natural mentorship occurs. So I feel like it's almost in the SDXD DNA for folks to be very, very proactive and learn by doing. And that was just so helpful during my time is when I went from being a volunteer to a board member, I got so much hands-on experience with organizing the events that when I transitioned into president, everything felt very natural and I knew what to do, while at the same time having the comfort that if anything crazy happened or if there's anything I was struggling with, you two are both just a call or a text away.
And one thing that I'll say too, just looking from, you know, from my perspective, it's just amazing how much it has grown. And in the ways that it has grown, which is that each of you put your own stamp on it and really took it to the next level and then the next level. And I think that's a great testament to a vibrant organization, right? It's not just one person, it's the community. And it's something that, like, you know, it's just amazing to see like what it's grown into. And I'd like to say, and I'd like to think that it's us thinking about that intentionally, right? Putting the structures in place for that kind of stuff. You don't want to scale too early, but you don't want to not think about scale. I mean, it's an important thing. And so I feel like we did put the structures in that allow it, but with enough flexibility that every cohort of organizing groups can put their stamp on this thing, and it just continues to grow, which is great.
And I think even within your group, allowing people to have a place to put a stamp was a learning point for me. So, you know, we had a couple board members and, you know, because you had done this call with us was like, hey, I want to have a one-on-one conversation. What do you think would be better? Or we could do better. What's working well? Sending some of those one-on-one conversations to people and getting some ideas from them on a one-on-one basis eventually kind of led us to these opportunities presented to us by the board members. And it's like, oh, do you want to take that on? Do you want to own that? Which I think led us to having like, I think it was the head of volunteer role. And then that board member really owned that. I don't know, there was all sorts of different ideas that people had. So just being open to the different ideas and figuring out different paths to allow your board members to provide feedback and then letting them take ownership over the ideas that they have kind of allows them to like add, you know, another stamp to that organization and really just takes it to another level because that's one less thing that you have to think about, or it's some brand new thing that you wouldn't have thought of and someone is totally owning it.
Yeah, we actually have a board member charter now that details not only the path to becoming a board member, but once you become one, what does that entail? And we have great milestones like organizing an event, bringing in speakers, bringing in sponsorship, leading a new initiative. So it's really more than just a title at SDXD. You have true impact and you get to make it your own. I feel like that's something super exciting and unique to our community.
It's an interesting thing that you say about the charter, because I don't think this is exactly what you mean, but it sparks a distinct memory in my mind, which is, and I think this is sort of a pro tip of sorts, which is letting board members know what they're signing on for and letting volunteers know. And I remember drafting email that just said, this is sort of the expected average, if you average it over time commitment per week for this kind of stuff. And these are the things. And just so they come in understanding, right? And it's somewhat of a contract is too strong of a term, but at least it's a mutual understanding, like, hey, this takes some legwork. Mm-hmm. And so just so you know, and please be aware of this, and please be able to honor this. If you can't, because life gets in the way, we can talk. But it's really important to sort of set those boundaries and be explicit about it, rather than just sort of like on a handshake and like, yay, we're in this together.
Yeah, we took that to, I think, and even a next level, and created a handout. It was like a group of us that came together and were, the board members, talking about like, what does it mean to be an SDXD board member? What do we expect out of our SDXD board members? Which ended up being, kind of an interesting conversation, because we ended up realizing that like, you don't necessarily have to be part of the conversation. You could be a listener on the conversation, thinking about making your way into the conversation, but you could have like kind of a heads down role. But then we also kind of outlined, how do we identify people that are going to put in the commitment, because, saying that you can be a board member because you want to, you're not necessarily going to get the best board members. You want people to like follow maybe a couple of steps to get there. So we outlined, had to attend so many, I think it was 6 events before you could become a board member. You had to talk with so many people within the community, and introduce yourself to the board members. You had to volunteer, I think, at least 3 times. And we created this little handout of, if you're interested, these are the things that you gain out of being a board member, but these are also the things that we expect out of people before they can become a board member, which I think made a really big difference in the board that we ended up with, because a few people would drop off through the process but were interested, and a few people made it through, and those were the ones that were a little bit more passionate about contributing, I think. Are you guys still doing stuff like that, James?
We are. Like you said, it's a great way to see who's committed in a long term, and really over those 3 volunteer experiences, you get a feel for who that individual is.
Yeah, I think that whole idea of, like, for lack of a better term, a probationary kind of period is really key, because I think you find, especially in organizations like this that start getting some momentum, lots of people come and they're like really interested. They're like, hey, I want to help out. And you're like, great. How many events have you been to? Well, this is my first one. Okay, well, how about after about 2 more events? Even just that attendance requirement, it's surprising how many people can't even make that. And then, like, hey, it's not like it's not like they're not interested, but maybe that's just their circumstances make it so that they can't be in regular attendance. If you can't be in regular attendance, how are you going to organize? Mm-hmm. And so just even having a criteria like that, I think was an important thing. And it actually sounds like you guys have even more stringent, just because you were much bigger. And I'm sure there was a lot more interest in volunteering and organizing and joining the board.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you just, for one thing, you need to know what you're signing up for by volunteering so many times, but also like attending the events at least 6 times helped to like make sure that you knew like what was the organization even about, without us having to explain it to you. Like, what was it to you? You should be able to answer that question. We don't necessarily, I mean, you could volunteer for just about any group, but you really want to volunteer for a group that you know that you want to be a part of. So I think that was a big important piece of it. Yeah.
So finding speakers for events was always really tricky, right? Like, I mean, that's like, events live and die by content. That's the whole point. And often with stuff like this, finding good speakers is like one of the trickiest things. And I remember in the early days, what we did, and this is a very intentional thing, but it also kind of layers in nicely with a new sort of community, is we had a distinct push to try to elevate members of the community and encourage them to get up on stage and give a talk about something, right? I mean, it's a great growth opportunity for them. And then we as a group would get speakers who would really deliver great content. And so it was like a true kind of win-win. And I know that was one of the techniques that we used early on. The other thing that we did is we actually had several board members who gave a talk. But you got to be a little careful about that, because you don't want it to be like one of these things where you built a community, not as a community, but as an audience, because you wanted to pontificate. And so you got to be careful of that. But it's one of the things that we did in the earlier days around, how do we get speakers? I know that that the group matured and maybe there are different levels and types of speakers that you can get. And I'm wondering if you guys can share your thoughts about that.
We did a lot, so I think ultimately, a lot of board members had a lot of connections, so they had people that could talk about things, but going to conferences and talking to people about what they're working on and finding out whether or not they're interested in talking about those things, and then making that connection to SDXD and talking about, we have this group with so many members, and such a large audience. But when you're getting started, that might be a little bit more difficult. So we did a lot of events that were quick talks on a particular topic. So just knowing, a couple researchers in the area that maybe have research stories, or, having somebody talk really quickly about tools that they love, which those were actually pretty popular events that gave people who maybe haven't spoken before an opportunity to do a quick 5 to 10 minute talk. And then just have this lineup of people, and you're going to have some really great content within however many speakers you can fit into several 5-minute talks or 10-minute talks. But I think, James, you've done a lot in terms of recruiting speakers, and I think you've got quite a few strategies here also that you could probably share with us.
Yeah, there's definitely a level of leveraging your existing network and just making that text or sending that LinkedIn message. And the beauty, as you both alluded to, is once you have that reputation within the community and the larger member base, it's very easy to send even a cold email out to a prospective speaker who you're interested in, and just make it concise but very clear your ask. This is who we are. This is what we'd like you to do. And in return, you'd have this outstanding experience with an engaged local community. So that's been extremely effective. And one really interesting thing about this situation is we've been able to expand our speaker network globally, and a lot of those same strategies apply. But now that it's all through Zoom, you don't have to worry about that plane ticket cost or the hotel costs.
One other thing you can do also, if you're having trouble finding speakers, or if you want to give yourself some padding to find speakers, SDXD's always been very big on the workshop events. So the workshops can be planned by the board without having to find specific speakers. You just need maybe a few facilitators, and maybe the board is all you need for facilitators, but also being creative in terms of who would be your speaker for an event. We've done a lot of events that were focused on improv, because improv techniques are great for UX designers. So find somebody who isn't necessarily in your industry who you can learn something from. So we had improv events, we had talk like a lawyer, and how can we learn from other industries. So if you're having a hard time finding speakers within your industry, you can look outside of your industry and try to figure out how can we learn a little bit more from the way you tell stories in your job, or the way that you argue in your job, and how can we use that as a way just to get more creative about expanding that pool of potential speakers.
Yeah, I love you bringing up the workshop aspect, because I feel and I remember back in my day, some of the workshops we put on were some of the more popular events. And there's some interesting aspects of that, which is, you might have a less than compelling speaker, which again, at 6 p.m. after work, it can really kind of drone on, right? And so it really lives and dies by the dynamics and the quality of the speaker. With a workshop, because it's hands-on and it's highly interactive, it's so engaging it really actually energizes people. And I remember there were a couple where they're like, this was the best thing. I'm so glad I came. I was really tired. I was like, but I forced myself because I really wanted to, interact with the community, and I really liked the topic, and they were so glad they did because they found it really energizing. So I think that's a great sort of thing to call out, which is workshops are amazing things, right? And they're and again, if you do it in a highly interactive way, the workshops almost run themselves, right? Like you make the ground rules and you're like, and you folks have at it, and they do amazing things. And so I think that's a great thing to bring up. I don't know, for us, workshops are great.
I think it was you who suggested to me also, like, try to do like an every other, speaker versus workshop versus, so that you have time to find the speakers for one thing, but also, and then also you're not doing too much work, planning workshops constantly, because several workshops in a row, that's a lot of work on the board. But it's also great, I think, for the audience to know you're going to have an interactive event, and then you're going to have something you can just sit down and listen to,
Yeah. Something that I'll bring up that James brought up, which is, when you're trying to find new speakers, especially maybe more sort of renowned speakers, this idea of social proof is really important for anybody who is starting to try, build a group like this and trying to attract speakers. I remember one of the things that we started doing was we intentionally started taking a lot of pictures, right, of the events. And we even ended up getting, like, one of our board members was a pretty good, they were a hobbyist photographer, but they had some skills, and they took some amazing pictures, and it really became an important piece where, I mean, if you think about it, it's like a 1-2 punch. If you're coming in cold, if you can say, we've got X number of members, and our events, like, we have a track record of having, 80 people show up at least. And by the way, if you want to go to our website, or you want to go up to our meetup site and see pictures, you can see these vibrant atmospheres. You can see these speakers like giving amazing talks. You can see all these people really engaged. This could be you. And that goes a long way for credibility and legitimacy, because I think as you sort of, for lack of a better term, move up the food chain, speakers, they have a lot of opportunities to speak, and so they're going to pick and choose. And so if you can supply a very credible organization with exactly the type of audience that they're hoping to reach and the number, and you can prove it, that goes a long way to attracting even more and more renowned speakers.
And if you're not quite at that level, I think there are some great ways to start finding speakers. There's a lot of groups that do happy hour events, and that's kind of a great way to just get people together and start having conversations about what are you doing, what are you working on, and to find potential speakers if you don't really know your audience very well. People love doing these happy hours where you're talking with like-minded people. So that's a great opportunity to just discover some people in your local community that you could have talk about topics.
So, in terms of building membership, at least for us, it was kind of early days, and it was really interesting. It was a two-pronged kind of thing. It was re-energizing people that had really been loyal to the previous incarnation of the group, and just kind of firing them back up to come out. And then the other part was reimagining ourselves and sort of rebranding ourselves to a new audience. And that is part of what we did. We ended up actually renaming, right? And that's how the SDXD name came about. And it was for a number of reasons, but one of which, it was to signal a fresh start. And so that we actually did a very intentional kind of outreach effort. And so, how we built membership in the early days was like I said, we re-energized the existing core base. And then we went out and we actually went to, because the San Diego community, the UX and design community is pretty vibrant and social. And so there were a couple of other groups. And so we made a point of going there and saying, hey, we have this group and this is what's unique about us. And we think you would really benefit from it and you should show up. And that's how we did it. We did it in a very organic way.
But Paul, you also did a lot, I think, to bring in other groups in order to build membership, and partnerships were a big part of that, right?
Right. I mean, that was, like I mentioned, there were other groups, either directly, in the same realm or actually adjacent. So there were other groups like SCGD and AIGA, and we were all friends because we all sort of hung out in the same circles and went to the same meetups. And it became a mutual support kind of club. And so we touted each other's events. We would co-host events, which were extremely successful, and everybody really benefited from that. And so, yeah, I think that's a really good strategy as well, is that, it's one of those like rising tide lifts all boats. And so it was a very successful, and I think it's the right way to do it, right? I mean, I imagine in certain locales, especially that have a large number of people, in the particular domain that your group might be in, there's a sense of competition. But for us, the whole point was not to compete, right? We were joining forces, and it turned out to be very successful.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, James, I think you are kind of bringing that back. I feel like it kind of fell off a little bit with the partnerships. We had some other strategies, which I'll talk to you later, but I know you're bringing that back a lot right now, aren't you?
Yeah. Now that everything's gone virtual and remote, I've actually been in contact with folks who used to live in San Diego and now have moved to other parts of the country, like Denver, Austin, Phoenix. And we're thinking, why not collaborate and just have an outlet to provide massive value to our collective audiences?
Yeah, I think, so a lot of that had fallen off in terms of the partnerships. Like, we were doing a few partner events every now and then when it made sense, but it was difficult to manage. So a lot of the things that we did to try to build membership was to make sure that we were talking on a wide variety of topics. So like reaching out to people that were interested in doing like the improv events would bring a potentially different crowd, making sure we had events that were heavily focused on research. You could definitely tell that brought a different crowd than the workshop events or the more design focused events, talking about, ethics in design, all these different topics would draw different people. But we also started having, I think when you first joined the board, James, we had you and another board member start interviewing people about what conferences, like especially the senior level people we were trying to draw in, what conferences have you gone to before, what talks did you attend, in order to kind of build that pipeline of events that maybe we wanted to talk about in order to draw that interest. So I think topics have a big ability to build your membership as well. I don't know, do you guys have any other strategies that come to mind here?
I do think that, we just talked about this with getting speakers, right? And that social proof. Same thing holds with membership. Nothing draws a crowd like a party. And so when you can have photos and you can show that, like, hey, this is something you don't want to miss out on, it becomes this sort of self-sustaining thing where people are like, hey, yeah, I want to show up there too. And so then you go from like, I remember in our early days, we're like, oh man, like, hey, we got more than 30 people who signed up, who said yes, and you know that you're going to have a certain percentage that are no shows, but that was a big thing until toward the end, at least my tenure, we were selling out and we were getting wait lists. And that was like an amazing accomplishment for us. And I know, Tara, when you were running the group, that was just the norm. And then now with you, James, it's like within an hour, there's huge wait lists, like just immediately. And I think that's a testament to that, the power that, the quality of the group first and foremost, but there is this notion, like, you become known and there's all this proof and like people want to be part of a thing. And so the more that you present as a thing, the more it becomes reality. And so I think it's a very important aspect. There's a marketing aspect to it.
Yeah.
and it's an important thing.
I think even with the photos, you could have a really great photographer take really great pictures, but you could always just have someone assigned a role to just like use your iPhone and take pictures of things and make sure you're taking pictures of the food and the beverages, so that on social media we can be mentioning all these things. And then those sponsors that we're mentioning will share these things, or other people at the event will share all these things. And then that just kind of helps other people have visibility into what's going on. And also to see like what your events have been like before when making a decision as to whether or not they want to attend the next one.
Right.
So
there's a snowball effect there where even if someone doesn't attend, a friend or a colleague will tell them the next day about the event, or they'll see a photograph and a testimonial in their feed on LinkedIn. And I got to say, I feel like there's something about just delivering tremendous value. I feel like none of us have really very closely monitored those numbers, but the membership growth just naturally came as we started delivering better and better events.
Right. And I think that's exactly it, right? It's not like you're trying to just game the numbers or anything like that. It was a very organic thing. It was actually a byproduct, like a happy byproduct, right? And it does start with that. It starts with building a really great community, building a really great forum for the community to get together, and providing great content. And I mean, if you build it, they will come. So I think that is something that's true. Like there's no amount of like marketing shenanigans and stuff like that that will grow you in a sustained way. And so if you provide quality and you're genuine, then it happens. And so I think this is a testament to that. SDXD definitely is a testament to that.
So when it comes to funding events, there's always materials that you need. SDXD always likes to provide food and beverage, and that's a great way to get people to show up to events and be interested in showing up to events, even if the topic might not be as great. But funding is a great thing to secure, and there's a lot of strategies for that. And I think with the future planning of events and knowing what your topics are and knowing who your potential sponsors are, goes a long way in making sure you can secure funding well in advance. Being able to send topics out to your point of contacts at different companies, and knowing that it aligns to things that maybe are in their roadmap or something like that, or just saying, hey, we have these next 3 events planned for the next 3 months. The following ones are subject to change, but we're also thinking about these ones. Which ones are of interest to you? Would you want to sponsor food, bev, or the venue? That's a great way to really get ahead on funding events. But I know there's always a starting point, and I think Paul can maybe speak a little bit to that, even though you were, I think, a little bit past a starting point.
Right. In the early days, sometimes if you got desperate, it was just like the organizers would just pitch in, and and you didn't require it, but you did it if you had to. But that was just like disaster plan. A lot of the stuff that you're talking about, Tara, is exactly it, right? You just find like companies that can, or organizations that can just provide just a little bit, or in-kind donations, right? Like maybe a venue. That's a big deal, right? Just finding a venue. We also ended up, and it just so happens that was just for our industry, but there's a vibrant sort of like gig economy around design. And so it's a natural sort of partnership with firms that offer placement help or contracting and that kind of stuff. And so they were a very natural fit to partner, because if they sponsored an event, they had X number of people right there who are exactly the kind of talent that they were hoping to connect with. And so that was a really good source back in the early days of funding and sponsorship.
Yeah, and to dovetail off that, it's really great just to know your stakeholder, just as we do with our design work, and understanding their needs and their goals. So as Tara alluded to, whenever possible, you can align the mission of the company with the topic of your event. That can be very powerful. And outside of that, there's some little things you can do to streamline the conversation with a prospective sponsor. We have a sponsorship packet which very clearly details for your sponsorship what you receive in exchange. And a lot of times those things are of minimal effort on the organizing part. So it's an announcement at the beginning and end of the event. It's shout outs on social media and the event registration page. And with that, it's just really great if you know how many people typically show up at your events, what's the demographic of the audience. And when you can communicate that clearly, many times good partnerships will ensue.
Mm-hmm. And I think right now we're dealing with this unfortunate situation, but it ended up turning up into potentially an opportunity for sponsorships now that we're like in this kind of like stay home, work from home environment. So James, I think you guys are doing a lot right now to capitalize in a way on the sponsorship opportunities that it presents, right?
Yes, it's outstanding.
Yeah. I think just the remote aspect, right?
Aspect,
like, all these companies that support remote or whatever.
Miro.
Absolutely. With the larger audiences that remote events have brought, and so many companies now looking for talent and to connect with people, it brings just an even greater opportunity for sponsorship, not just locally, but across the globe.
Something that you said really sort of struck a chord, which is it's a bit more tactical, but it may not be as obvious to maybe a new organizer, which is sponsorship packages are a very important thing, which is what do you get, who can you reach, those types of things. And why that's important is not necessarily directly to your contact. Your contact may totally be on board, but they have to pitch it to their boss. And so if you can provide that material that they can say, look, this is a legit group. They have this many people. They have this type of people. These are the types of events they put on. Here's what we're going to get. We're going to get a title slide at the beginning. We'll get, a couple minutes to talk to the crowd. We'll be able to put out some material. That kind of stuff is very important because, you're trying to help your potential sponsor say yes, and giving them that material so that they can convince the decision makers is really key. And so it's worthwhile to put those things together. They don't have to be too fancy, but having that key information goes a long way.
That's where some of the photos also come into play, like showing that you have an event that has a bunch of people, making sure your photographer is taking pictures of large groups of people to show that there's going to be visibility if you sponsor one of these events. But along with like, these are the events that we have upcoming, and here's what some of last year's events looked like. But also like who you're talking to has a big part of it. So we worked with recruiting companies, I know a lot, before I was president. And one of the things we discovered was once I started talking to, so we would work a lot with the recruiters themselves. They're interested in the talent that shows up at the event. Later, I ended up establishing a relationship with an account manager at a recruiting company, and they're interested in the companies that are hosting the events. And that's a very, very different dynamic. So having a point of contact with one recruiting company with an account manager, what they care about is who's hosting the event versus the recruiter. What they care about is who is going to be at the event. So you have very different strategies with the different people that might be potential sponsors, but also if you're dealing with recruiting companies, making sure, I learned this from you, Paul, I believe, don't have an event where you have two, recruiting companies sponsoring together. If you have a recruiting company, you pair them with maybe a company of interest, right?
Right. Something also, which is, and you guys have evolved into this, is partnering with companies that provide tools for your membership, right? So for us, it's design tools and those types of things. And they're very interested. I mean, a lot of companies, especially the bigger ones, they literally have just consistent, sustained community outreach arms. Because in this day and age of the way that software is adopted is, it's one by one. Somebody wants to do it, they start using it at work, they tell their friends, and all of a sudden the entire company's using it. And so they are very keen to get in there on the ground floor with the individuals that might be using their tools. And so that's a really great source of partnership and funding.
Yes, and if you don't have a contact there, it can really be as simple as going on the company website, seeing their contact us page, and then emailing them your sponsorship packet and a
Yep.
quick blurb about how and why you'd like to collaborate.
Yep. Yeah, I remember we did an event. I don't know if it was an event or a separate talk, but it was actually an interesting story because we ended up using a free version of this prototyping tool. And we had a bunch of people who were using it for this workshop, tweeting their usage of it and what they were doing and why they thought it was so cool at that company's handle. And they were like, this is amazing. Like, you're using this stuff. And we're like, hey, how about you sponsor our next event? And so that works really well too.
Another aspect of sponsoring that I thought was interesting, we ended up with a strategic partnership role, and the person who was in that role ended up finding all these opportunities for sponsorship, but wasn't necessarily sponsoring in the ways that we normally offered. So like we were always looking for food and beverage sponsors or venue sponsors, but he secured things like licenses to remote tools that the board could use, and then we would promote them at an event and maybe find a way to use them at the event, but we would get all this extra, like, for the rest of the year value out of it for planning our events. Some sponsors would provide books every single month, and then that would be a giveaway that we would, if you live tweet about our event, or if you tweet about something you learned using this hashtag as a way to promote your event and expand visibility, that would be a way to get a prize at the end. So I think being open to sponsor opportunities that maybe you're not looking for, and talking to these people about, like, hey, in what way would you be interested in sponsoring if it's something that maybe we're not offering, I think that can provide quite a bit of value. We've talked about a lot of things. Clearly there's a lot that go into these events, but there are so many things that you get out of being part of a group like this. Being a board member, I learned so much, but like being like the person who actually runs the event, it was a completely different experience. And I think there's a lot of value that you can get out of this, and your community gets out of this. For me, I was definitely a little bit nervous taking the role, but it ended up being a great experience because people kind of look at you as being an expert in this industry, regardless of whether or not you are. And I'm kind of curious, do you guys kind of feel the same way, or did you guys experience something different from running in a group like this?
I think it's well worth it. So you talk about it, there's a lot that goes into these kinds of things, right? And obviously, unless you've done this kind of stuff before, you're not sure whether you can. You're not sure whether you should, right? It takes a lot of work, but it is so well worth it. I know just from in terms of like leadership experience, right? It's a great way to build leadership experience. And I've always joked about this with you guys before, which is, it's one thing that if you, like, at work, you manage somebody and you basically, you can tell them what to do because you kind of control their livelihood, right? In the reporting structure. When you're leading a group like this, all volunteer, you really learn effective techniques about inspiring, supporting organization with a group of people doing significant effort where it's all just volunteer, where it's all just on their own sort of willingness to do it. And they could just as easily just say, and tap out. I'm too busy, not going to do it. So it's a great opportunity to flex those muscles and learn those kind of techniques around leadership. Because if you can lead, and you can lead a successful group and have successful events and grow a successful community like this, I mean, that is amazing. That means that you can lead in any kind of organization.
Yes, it's that whole notion of leading without influence. And I feel like in this capacity, you learn so many skills that will serve you for a lifetime. Like, I can whip together an outreach or a thank you email in no time flat, thanks to all the reps that I've gotten from this. And more so than that, I'll just always cherish the memories and experiences from this. So I hope we didn't scare anyone off with all these aspects of building a community and the potential things that can go wrong and to account for, because it is just so worth it. It's a special thing that you can do and share with yourself, your organizing team, and your community, everyone who attends the events.
it's very rewarding, I think, putting these events on and being there for the aftermath and then being able to see like what it was when you started and what it became afterwards, but also seeing the way that you have grown. I think in a lot of ways it's sort of like fast tracked my career, because I'm really deeply thinking about certain aspects of this industry. And I think you learn it by teaching a lot of ways, or you learn by trying to figure out like, how can I help a group of people, understand this thing, and what would be even a good thing for them to understand. So there's just kind of like, I think, an endless amount of value you get from it. And the networking is huge. There's just so many benefits to running groups like this. And it's a lot of fun, I think.
I do think that it is a lot of fun. And we did talk about it, right? And I want to emphasize it. It's a designed experience as well. I mean, we are designers, and so we're always thinking this way. But it's so true that like why this group has been so successful is that, one, we get great people to organize it, and we have great membership and a great community. But two, we made the experience great as well, not just as being a member, but organizing it. And so, I think it's really important. I think it's an important thing to do. And if you're thinking about it, if you're just like, hey, I'd like to do something like that, or at least I'd like to join the leadership or organizers of some group that I really like, you should do it. It's well worth it. It's all upside, right? Worst case scenario, it's like, it's not for me. And then you just continue as a regular member. But there's so many connections, so much growth, so much learning, that it is so well worth it that if you're even just kind of thinking about it, which may be why you're watching this talk, you should do it.